I never thought that the sharpest wound of my life would come not from death itself, but from what followed after. Losing my husband Richard was a pain I knew I would carry until my last breath, but what my son did to me after his father's funeral carved an even deeper scar, one that I can never fully explain without my voice breaking. My name is Eleanor Grace Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a widow, and once I believed myself to be the quiet heart of Hazelbrook Orchards, the small organic farm that Richard and I poured our lives into for decades. I believed that family and hard work were enough to keep us whole. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. Richard and I built Hazelbrook from nothing more than a dream and a patch of land that most folks in our town thought was worthless. We planted trees with our own hands, watered them through dry summers, and protected them from storms in winter. The orchard became not just our livelihood but our legacy. I raised my children among those trees. I can still see them running between the rows, their laughter echoing as the blossoms fell like snow around them. Those memories are carved deep in my heart. But grief has a way of warping the world, and funerals have a way of showing you truths you wish you'd never learned. When Richard died, I thought my children would circle around me, hold me steady, as I stumbled through those first raw days of loss. Instead, I felt them drift away, as though my sorrow was an anchor they were desperate to cut loose from. My son Michael was the one who cut deepest. He is 38 years old, tall like his father, but without Richard's gentle eyes. Michael has always carried ambition like a sword, sharp and ready to cut through anything that stood in his way. Even me. Perhaps I should have seen it coming, the way he spoke more about expansion and profits than about the orchard itself, the way he treated Hazelbrook less like a family home and more like a business ripe for takeover. But I was his mother. I wanted to believe his heart still carried the same love I had poured into him as a boy. The day of Richard's funeral was gray and heavy with drizzle. I remember standing beside the grave, clutching my daughter's hand, feeling the earth swallow the man who had been my partner for more than 4 decades. People came with condolences, with casseroles, with hollow words meant to fill the silence. And when it was all over, when the last shovel of dirt had been smoothed over Richard's coffin, Michael came to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Let me drive you home, Mom." I thought it was kindness. I thought finally, here was my son stepping into the role his father once held, protector, steady hand, comfort. I followed him to the car, carrying only a small suitcase of black clothes and the ache of loss. But instead of driving me home, Michael turned down a road I didn't recognize. The further we went, the narrower the lane became, the trees closing in like watchful eyes. I asked him where we were going, but he didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed ahead. When the car finally stopped, we were on a desolate stretch of road. No houses, no lights, just silence. He turned off the engine, reached over and opened my door. "This is where you get off," he said. For a moment I thought I hadn't heard him right. My grief-addled mind couldn't comprehend the words, what I whispered. He didn't look at me. He just pushed the suitcase into my lap. "You can't stay at the farm anymore. It's not your place now. Dad left things to me. It's time you moved on." I stared at him. My breath caught in my chest, my heart pounding with disbelief. My own son, the boy I had carried, the child I had rocked to sleep, the man I had prayed over, was telling me to get out of his life as if I were nothing more than an unwanted guest. Tears blurred my vision. "Michael, I'm your mother. Hazelbrook is my home. It's where you were raised. How can you—" He cut me off, his voice cold. "It's business, Mom. You'll be fine. But I need to do what's right for the orchard now. You don't belong there anymore." I sat frozen, the rain pattering softly against the windshield. My fingers clutched the suitcase as if it could anchor me to the life I knew, but it felt impossibly small, a pathetic symbol of all I was losing. Slowly I stepped out of the car, my shoes sinking into the damp gravel. Michael didn't even wait for me to shut the door. The engine roared, and he drove away, leaving me standing alone on that forsaken road with nothing but a suitcase and a hollow ache where my family should have been. The shock was suffocating. I remember looking down the empty road, hoping that he would turn back, that this was some cruel misunderstanding. But the taillights faded into the distance, swallowed by the rain, and I realized he wasn't coming back. My son had abandoned me. I don't remember how long I stood there. Minutes, hours. Time loses meaning when your heart is breaking. Eventually, a kind stranger passing by stopped their truck and asked if I needed help. With shaking hands, I explained what had happened, though I couldn't bear to admit the truth that my son had left me there intentionally. I let them drive me to a small inn on the outskirts of town. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, every memory of Michael's childhood playing in my mind like a cruel film reel. His first steps in the orchard. The way he used to pick apples just to bring them to me proudly, as though he had grown them himself. The laughter we shared under those trees. How had that boy become the man who could abandon his mother on a lonely road after burying his father? The pain of grief and betrayal mixed together into something indescribable, something heavier than either alone. I felt like I was drowning. But even in that darkness, a small flame began to burn, a flame of anger, of defiance. I had given too much love, too deeply sacrificed, too often to let it end this way. Michael might think he could erase me from Hazelbrook, from the family legacy Richard and I built, but he had underestimated me. He had forgotten that grief can make a woman crumble, but it can also make her stronger than anyone ever imagined. That night alone in that small inn room, I made myself a promise. I would not disappear quietly. I would not let my son's betrayal define the final chapter of my life. I would fight for Hazelbrook, for Richard's memory, for my place as the heart of the family I had built with my own 2 hands. And one day, Michael would learn that betraying a mother is a wound that carries consequences he could never predict. The morning after that dreadful night at the inn, I woke with a heaviness that seemed to press me into the mattress. My body ached, but not from age. It was the ache of abandonment, of carrying a truth too shameful to admit aloud. My son had cast me out like refuse. No one at the inn knew. I let them believe I was a widow traveling alone, seeking a few nights of quiet after the funeral of my husband. I let them believe because the truth that my own flesh and blood had left me on a deserted road was too unbearable to speak. I remember sitting in the dining room sipping weak coffee, watching families around me share their meals. Mothers laughing with their children, fathers patting their sons on the back, the simple warmth of togetherness. It was like staring at a life I once had but could never return to. The grief clung to me like a second skin. But underneath that grief was a question that refused to quiet. Why? Why had Michael done this to me? Was it greed? Power? Resentment I never saw? I thought of the orchard of Hazelbrook's rows of apple trees standing tall under the gray sky, and I realized that for him it had ceased to be a home. It was a prize. And in his eyes, I was an obstacle. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. Over the last few years, Michael had spoken often about modernization, about bringing in investors, about expanding Hazelbrook into something larger, something shinier. Richard and I resisted. We wanted Hazelbrook to stay true to its roots, organic, humble, built on family and soil. But Michael wanted more. He wanted to turn it into an empire, and now with Richard gone, I was the only thing left standing in his way. I stayed at the inn for 2 days, unsure of where to go next. My daughter Claire lived 3 towns over. She had a small home and a family of her own. We hadn't always seen eye to eye, but she loved me, and I knew that if she found out what Michael had done, her anger would burn as fiercely as mine. But telling her would mean exposing a truth that humiliated me to my core. How could I look her in the eye and admit that her brother had discarded me like trash? Still, I had nowhere else to turn. On the 3rd morning, I called her. My voice was shaky, but I told her I needed to see her. She didn't ask questions, only said, "Come, Mom. Stay with us as long as you need." When I arrived, Claire embraced me tightly, her arms wrapping around me like a shield. "You're too thin," she murmured, "and your eyes, you haven't slept in days." I wanted to cry into her shoulder, to pour everything out, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I told her only part of the truth, that I felt unwelcome at Hazelbrook, that Michael was already stepping into Richard's role, that I didn't know where I belonged anymore. Her eyes hardened. That orchard wouldn't exist without you, Mom. Without you and Dad, there would be no Hazelbrook. Michael knows that. He's just blinded by ambition, but he doesn't get to erase you. Erase. The word lodged in my chest. That was exactly what Michael wanted to erase me, to rewrite the story, so that Hazelbrook became his triumph alone. For weeks, I stayed with Claire. She and her husband made space for me in their home, and her children filled the rooms with laughter. Their love was a balm, but it didn't erase the wound. Every night I lay awake thinking of Hazelbrook, the trees I had nurtured, the land I had poured myself into, the farmhouse where Richard and I had shared our lives. I pictured Michael there, striding through the orchard as though he owned it all, and my heart clenched with both sorrow and fury. One evening, Claire sat me down at the kitchen table. "Mom, you have to fight this," she said firmly. "Dad left that orchard to both of you. If Michael's trying to push you out, you have rights." But I shook my head. "It's not just about rights, Claire. It's about betrayal. He's my son. How do I fight my own child in court? How do I survive that?" Her eyes filled with tears. "How do you survive letting him take everything you and Dad built?" Her words cut deep, because they were true. If I walked away quietly, Hazelbrook would become his, and Richard's memory would be twisted into something unrecognizable. The orchard wasn't just land, it was our life, our story, our legacy, and I couldn't let Michael rewrite it. The decision settled in me slowly, like the ground hardening after a storm. I would not let him erase me. I would not let his betrayal become the final word. But still I wrestled with my heart, because beneath the anger was a mother's love that refused to die. I remembered Michael as a boy, his small hand clutching mine, his laughter ringing through the orchard as he climbed trees too high for his own good. I remembered sitting by his bed when he was sick, praying feverishly for his fever to break. I remembered his teenage years, his dreams, his promises. How could that boy have grown into this man? The question haunted me, but the answer mattered less than the choice before me. Either I fought for Hazelbrook, or I surrendered everything Richard and I had built to a son who no longer saw me as his mother, only as an obstacle. I began gathering documents, old deeds, wills, anything Richard and I had signed together. I found letters he had written, journal entries he had kept about the orchard, proof that Hazelbrook had always been our shared dream, not Michael's conquest. Each paper I collected felt like a small piece of armor, a shield against the betrayal that had gutted me. As I worked, I felt Richard's presence beside me, steady and unwavering. He had always told me I was stronger than I believed, that beneath my quiet exterior was a will of iron. Now I began to understand what he meant. Still, the wound of Michael's words lingered. "This is where you get off." The memory replayed endlessly in my mind, his voice cold, detached. It was the moment my motherhood shattered. I had carried him into this world, raised him, loved him with every fiber of my being, and he had reduced me to nothing with 6 words. But as I pieced together the fragments of my resolve, I whispered a promise to myself. This is not where I get off. This is where I begin again. And so, with trembling hands, but a steady heart, I prepared for the fight ahead. Because betrayal may break you, but it can also forge you into something stronger. And I was determined that my son would learn that truth, no matter the cost. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, sleepless nights, and a gnawing ache in my chest that never quite left. Each morning, I would rise early in Claire's home, sit at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and spread out documents in front of me. Deeds, bank statements, old photographs of Richard and me standing proudly among the apple trees we had planted together. Each paper carried weight, not just in ink and signatures, but in memory. Proof that Hazelbrook was not just soil and profit, it was a life, our life. But while I tried to anchor myself in determination, the shame of Michael's betrayal clung like a second skin. At night, I would hear Claire's children laughing down the hallway, and my heart would ache, wondering if they would ever look at me the way Michael once had. With trust, with unfiltered love. One afternoon, Claire's husband David came home early from work. He found me hunched over the table, tears streaming down my face as I held one of Richard's old journals. Without a word, he set his hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. I nodded, though my throat was too tight for words. Still, loneliness stalked me, no matter how much support Claire and David gave. Because at the end of the day, betrayal is a solitary wound. It isolates you, makes you question not just others, but yourself. What had I done to deserve this? Where had I failed as a mother? The questions circled endlessly until I realized something I could drown in them forever, or I could act. So I called Michael. The line rang 3 times before his voice came through brisk and impatient. Mom. It was not a greeting, not warmth, just a flat acknowledgement. Michael, I said softly, steadying my breath. We need to talk. About Hazelbrook. About what happened. There was a pause, then a sigh. Mom, I already told you. You didn't tell me anything. I interrupted, my voice firmer now. You left me on a road like I was nothing. You owe me more than that. His silence on the other end was heavy, and for a moment I thought he might hang up. But finally he said, Fine. Tomorrow. At the orchard. The next day, Claire insisted on coming with me, but I refused. This was my battle, my wound, my reckoning. When I arrived at Hazelbrook, the sight of the orchard nearly brought me to my knees. The trees stood tall in proud blossoms fluttering in the wind, their branches heavy with promise. It should have felt like homecoming, but instead, it felt like trespassing. My own home now felt like enemy ground. Michael was waiting near the farmhouse. He wore a suit crisp and sharp, as if he were about to meet investors rather than his grieving mother. The sight of him so polished, so cold, made my heart ache. Mom, he said, nodding stiffly. Michael. We stood in silence for a moment, the air thick with everything unsaid. Finally, I spoke. Why? He blinked. Why what? Why did you leave me there? Why did you throw me out of my own home? His jaw tightened. Because you don't understand, Mom. Hazelbrook needs to evolve. Dad's vision was fine for his time, but times have changed. Investors want modernization. They want returns. You cling to the past, and it's holding us back. I couldn't let you interfere. His words struck like knives. Interfere, I whispered. Michael, I planted those trees with your father. I raised you under their branches. Hazelbrook is not just a business, it's our life, our legacy. To you, maybe, he said coolly. To me, it's a future, and sentiment doesn't pay the bills. I felt the air leave my lungs. My son, my own flesh and blood, spoke of Hazelbrook as if it were nothing more than a commodity, as if Richard's sweat, my years of sacrifice, the love that bound us to that land meant nothing. You're erasing me, I said, my voice trembling. Erasing your father, erasing everything that made Hazelbrook what it is. His eyes flickered just for a second with something guilt, regret, but it was gone in an instant. I'm saving it, he replied. You just can't see it. My hands clenched at my sides. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand he see me, but I realized then that I couldn't force him. He had already chosen his path, so I chose mine. I won't let you take it from me, I said quietly but firmly. Hazelbrook is mine as much as it is yours, and if I have to fight for it, I will. His face hardened. Then fight. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the shadow of the orchard that had once been my home. I drove back to Claire's in silence, my heart both shattered and ignited. The wound of betrayal had deepened, but so had my resolve. Michael thought he could break me, reduce me to silence. But he had forgotten one thing: I had survived loss before. I had survived hardship, loneliness, and grief. I could survive this too. That night, I sat at Claire's table again, documents spread before me. Richard's journal open to a page written in his careful hand. Hazelbrook is love made visible, he had written, and love must always be protected. I pressed my hand to the page, tears falling freely. I will protect it, Richard, I whispered, even if I have to protect it from our own son. And with those words, the flame inside me became a fire. Betrayal had wounded me, but it would also be my weapon, because the orchard was not just land, it was memory, it was love, and I would not let it be erased. The weeks after that confrontation with Michael felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, wind tearing at my clothes, the ground crumbling beneath me. Every step forward was a choice between falling and flying, but I knew one thing with certainty: I could not turn back. Not anymore. Claire was the first to see the change in me. She came into the kitchen one morning, found me already at the table with Richard's journals open, papers spread in careful stacks, a pen in my hand. She raised her eyebrows. "You're ready, aren't you?" I nodded. "I can't let him erase me, Claire, or your father." Her hand squeezed mine. "Then we'll do this together. Together." The word warmed me in a way I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't completely alone. I had her. I had her children. I had Richard's memory. And now I had purpose. I began making appointments. Lawyers, accountants, people who knew the language Michael thought he could wield against me. I carried Richard's journals to each meeting, my voice trembling at first, then strengthening as I explained what Hazelbrook truly was: not just land, not just profit, but legacy. Some professionals looked at me with skepticism, seeing only an aging widow clinging to sentiment. But others saw the fire in my eyes. They listened. They advised. They armed me with knowledge I hadn't possessed before. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the town. People noticed that I wasn't at the farmhouse anymore, that Michael was running Hazelbrook alone. Some asked quietly where I was staying, why I hadn't been seen among the trees I had nurtured for decades. Shame kept me silent at first, but gradually I began to tell the truth. Not in anger, not in slander, but in raw honesty. "My son asked me to leave," I said softly to a neighbor in the grocery store. "He told me Hazelbrook wasn't mine anymore." The woman's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened with shock and then narrowed with indignation. And just like that, the truth began to spread. Not whispered gossip, but a story that stirred the hearts of those who had known Richard and me since the very beginning. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph Richard and me taken years ago at the county fair, standing proudly beside a crate of apples we'd submitted for judging. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Don't let them take what you built. We're with you." I sat at Claire's kitchen table with that photo pressed to my chest, tears streaming down my face. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The town knew, and many of them stood with me. Michael, of course, heard the whispers. His response was swift. He sent me a letter, cold, formal, typed on Hazelbrook letterhead. "Cease and desist from spreading falsehoods about Hazelbrook management," it read. "Failure to comply will result in legal consequences." I laughed bitterly when I read it. Legal consequences. From my own son. As though motherhood were a contract he could tear apart with the right words. But instead of breaking me, his threat hardened me further. That night I stood in Claire's backyard looking up at the stars, and I spoke aloud to Richard. He thinks he can frighten me into silence. But he doesn't know me, not really. You did. You knew I had steel in me even when I doubted it, and I will prove you right. The following week, I arranged a town meeting at the community hall. Claire helped me spread the word, and when I walked in that evening, the room was nearly full. Faces I had known for decades turned toward me. Neighbors, fellow farmers, old friends. My knees shook as I stood at the podium, but then I remembered Michael's words. "This is where you get off." No, this was where I began again. "My name is Eleanor Grace Whitmore." I began, my voice trembling at first, then growing stronger. "Many of you knew my husband Richard. Together we built Hazelbrook orchards from nothing. We planted every tree, tended every branch, poured our lives into the soil. It wasn't just our livelihood, it was our love made visible." The room was silent, rapt. But after Richard's passing, my own son told me I no longer belonged there. He left me on a road with nothing but a suitcase. He tried to erase me. And now he wants to turn Hazelbrook into something it was never meant to be, an empire of greed, stripped of its roots, stripped of its soul. Gasps rippled through the hall. Faces hardened with outrage. "I am not here to destroy my son." I continued, my throat tight with emotion. "I am here to protect what Richard and I built. I am here to protect Hazelbrook's heart, and I am asking you to stand with me." When I finished, there was silence for a heartbeat. Then one by one people stood. Applause filled the hall, loud and unyielding. Tears blurred my vision. I had spoken my truth and they had heard me. But the fight was not over. If anything, it had just begun. Michael was furious when he heard about the meeting. He called me late that night, his voice like ice. "You've made a mistake, Mom." "No, Michael," I replied, my voice steady. "The mistake was thinking you could erase me." There was a long silence on the line, broken only by his sharp inhale. Then he hung up without another word. I knew then that the climax was coming. He would not back down quietly, and neither would I. As I lay awake that night, the stars glittering faintly outside the window, I felt Richard's presence again, calm and steady. I whispered into the darkness, "I'm ready, love. Whatever comes next, I'm ready." Because betrayal may wound, but it also transforms. And I was no longer just a widow abandoned on a lonely road. I was a mother, a fighter, the keeper of a legacy, and I would not let it be stolen. The weeks after that town hall meeting moved like a storm. Rumors spread quickly, each retelling of what Michael had done to me, adding fuel to the fire. Some softened the story, others sharpened it, but the truth at its core remained: a son had betrayed his mother, and a widow was fighting for her legacy. I had not intended for my pain to become public spectacle, but perhaps that was inevitable. Betrayal in private is a wound. Betrayal in public is a reckoning. Michael retaliated with everything he had. He brought in lawyers, sent letters filled with legal jargon meant to intimidate. He cut me off financially, freezing accounts I had once shared with Richard. He told neighbors that grief had driven me irrational, that I was clinging to the past, that I was too old and too fragile to understand modern business. His words were cruel, but in a way they only revealed his fear. Because if I were truly powerless, why fight so hard to silence me? Claire stayed by my side, unwavering. Some nights I broke down in her kitchen, weeping into her arms, whispering that I didn't know if I had the strength to keep going. But then I would remember Richard's journal, his words etched in ink. Hazelbrook is love made visible. Love must always be protected. And I would wipe my tears and steel myself for another day. The climax came one crisp autumn morning when a court hearing was scheduled to address ownership disputes. I walked into that courthouse with trembling hands but a steady heart. The room smelled of old wood and dust, the air heavy with tension. Michael sat at the opposite table, sharp in his suit, his eyes avoiding mine. For a moment, I saw not the man, but the boy he once was, sitting beside me at the kitchen table, his face sticky with apple pie, his eyes bright with love. The memory stabbed me with both sorrow and fury. The judge asked questions, lawyers spoke in circles, papers shuffled endlessly. But when it was my turn, I rose slowly, clutching Richard's journal in my hands. My voice shook, but I did not falter. My husband and I built Hazelbrook from nothing. I began. We did not inherit it. We did not buy it as an investment. We planted it tree by tree with our own hands. We nurtured it through storms, droughts, and lean years. We raised our children under its branches. Hazelbrook is not just property, it is family. And when my son left me on a road after his father's funeral, suitcase in my lap, telling me I no longer belonged, he was not just discarding me. He was discarding everything this orchard stands for. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes dark. I am not asking for control out of greed. I continued, my tears falling freely now. I am asking for recognition that I am part of Hazelbrook, that my husband's memory is part of Hazelbrook, that no amount of profit or modernization can erase the love that built it. I may be 68, I may be a widow, but I am not invisible, and I will not be erased. When I finished, silence filled the room. Even the judge looked moved. For the first time in months, I felt truly seen. The case did not resolve that day. It dragged on for weeks more, but something shifted. The town rallied more fiercely behind me. Local newspapers wrote about the widow fighting for her orchard. Neighbors brought meals, letters of support, small donations to help with legal fees. Everywhere I went, people looked me in the eye with respect, with sympathy, with admiration. And Michael, despite his wealth and his lawyers, began to lose ground, not just legally, but morally, because what he had done could not be hidden anymore. The final verdict granted me co-ownership rights that Michael had tried to strip away. Hazelbrook was no longer solely his to claim. I would remain tied to the land I had built with Richard, legally and forever. But victory did not feel sweet. It felt heavy, bittersweet, like standing in the ruins of something precious. because while the orchard remained mine, my son felt lost to me. Michael avoided me after the ruling, his pride too deep, his anger too raw. Perhaps one day he will come back to me, softened by time, humbled by life. But for now, the chasm between us remains. And yet I do not regret fighting. Because I did not just fight for myself. I fought for Richard, for Hazelbrook, for every sacrifice we made together. I fought for the truth that betrayal cannot erase love, and that legacy belongs not to greed, but to those who nurture it. One evening, weeks after the case ended, I returned to Hazelbrook. The air was crisp, the trees heavy with fruit. I walked slowly among the rows, my fingers brushing the bark of trees I had planted as saplings. Memories flooded me, Richard's laughter, my children's small feet racing down the paths, the countless hours of labor and love. My heart ached, but it also swelled with pride. I stopped beneath one of the oldest trees, knelt down and pressed my hand to the soil. "We did it, love," I whispered. "They tried to erase me, but I'm still here. We're still here." The wind stirred through the branches as though answering me, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. This story is not just about loss or betrayal or even revenge. It is about survival, about refusing to vanish when the world tries to silence you, about standing tall even when those you love most betray you. So if you are listening to me now and you have ever felt erased by family, by life, by grief, I want you to hear this. You are still here. You matter. Your scars are not weakness. They are proof that you endured, proof that you loved and fought and survived. And if my story touched you, I hope you will stay with me. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell me your story, your scars, your survival. Because when we share our truths, we remind each other that betrayal does not end us. It remakes us.